Welcome to the Rooted in Light podcast. I'm your host, Tuesday Rivera, and I'm here with my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Gabrielle Donnelly. And today we're going to talk a little bit about Gabe's own journey into more of herself. I have to tell you, I've known Gabe for probably 10 years at least, maybe 15. And of course, we started off as just kind of like, two people, acquaintances, like kind of passing each other in professional spaces. And then we started working together a little bit more. And then really when my own personal journey began to take off, like when I really started making big changes in my life, Gabe as a colleague was one of the people that I turned to most. And I don't think it was because of my personal transformation. I think it happened alongside. Our friendship just really deepened. And what I will say to you is not only has she been one of my biggest champions and supporters, she has dived into her own personal work in kind of miraculous ways. And so knowing Gabe from 10 or 15 years ago until now, those of you who are watching the video can see Gabe glows. But this is not, Gabe has always been beautiful. She's always been like, like somebody like, oh, that one's got something special. But I would say in the last year, I have just seen you glow in a way that I want for everyone. And so I invited Gabe onto the podcast today to share a little bit because it's been a well-earned glow, my friend. It has not been easy.
Yes.
And so part of what I want to do with this podcast is bring these stories of transformation without like the just kind of glow up at the end, right? I want people to actually understand that this is really a process, and sometimes it's quite dark.
Yes.
So that's
And
how
we're
I'm
gonna
inviting
go
you
there
in today. Great.
Thank you.
Gabe, what might you tell people about yourself before I kind of start to ask you questions about your journey?
Oh, happy to introduce myself a bit and to be here with you Tuesday in the first season of your new podcast and to be really, I think, as you said, in a continuation of the kinds of conversations and mutual support and reciprocity we have been in together over these past few years quite intensely. And so it's just a really great moment for us to be here in this, and I'm really grateful. And so who am I? Well, I'm joining you from Ulnu territory, the land of the Mi'kmaq, which is in Nova Scotia, Canada, where I live. And, I'm the daughter of Irish poets and folk musicians and rebels. And I am the daughter and the descendant of really grounded, pragmatic Yorkshire folk in northern England, and increasingly connecting to those ancestries. My mother is relearning Gaeilge Irish as a language that she learned as a child in school, and so turning towards that culturally. So these are parts of what's happening in my life, but I'm also a daughter and a spouse to a pretty incredible human, a man, and I am a scholar practitioner, so I teach in universities and write and research and work in other spaces with Tuesday as well. And I'm also a dog mom, which I didn't ever think that I would say it. When I adopted a dog, I thought, I'm not going to be a dog mom. I'm just going to be a great dog guardian. But I have fully and utterly embraced that title. And maybe the other thing that I'll say before going into things is one of the things that sort of is sparking joy for me these days is I'm studying floriography, which is the language of flowers, and how to communicate in gifting flowers and receiving flowers.
Wow.
So this is something that, is brightening my 2025.
I love this. I love that in the middle of a Nova Scotia winter, you are working with flowers, right?
Yes. Yes.
So I want to hear more about that, because I suspect that's that's one of those, we talk about in the midst of transformation, what we can look for are these little signals, right? Like we might want our whole life to be different than what it is right now. And sometimes that happens, like things turn on a dime. But often what happens is we just begin to get these little signals, right? That like, oh, follow that. That will give you happiness, or that will bring you something, or that's a path to follow. And we just never know where it's going to go. And I suspect floriography might be one of those little signals you have followed.
Certainly it has. And I think I started last year, but it's in many ways a remembrance and a returning to a version of me from my early 20s, who, as part of moving to Nova Scotia and this land and wanting to connect with this place, I started to study herbal medicine.
Ah.
And using and growing wildflowers and medicine and turning them into tinctures and all kinds of things. I know, something you don't know about me. Yeah, I studied it quite intensely for about 3 years. On the side, I don't have any certification. You could call me kind of a kitchen witch.
Great. I will from now on.
Yes. Just puttering around in all of that. And as one of the things out of this big phase of transformation that we'll talk about, for me, has been a lot of returning to versions of myself from earlier times. And part of that was being out in the woods, collecting medicine, learning the names of flowers and trees and plants. And so that I'm doing that again, but this time with flowers, which feels more, it's less purposeful in the sense of the whole purpose is communication and adornment and beauty.
Wow.
And I think that's perhaps the big shift is in my life. I am doing things just for the pleasure of them, not necessarily for the pragmatics of them.
This is huge. That's huge. Like just to even name that, like the idea of doing things for pleasure versus purpose, the way we normally think about it, or getting things done, right? Which is like my kryptonite. Like I just love to get shit done. That's my thing, like give me a list. I'm going to get it done. And so that's okay, I'm not going to go there. I'm going to move us back. I'm going to move us back to when you started, because I just said the word signals, right? And, they often are way kind of like moving out of a transformation stage is like to notice the signals and begin to follow them. But I suspect like as you were entering into this kind of big change in your life, which of course, as we go when we have no idea is going to be a big change in our life, that there were signals, signs that something needed to change, something was changing. And so can you just bring me there, however you would do that? What were your signals into the transformation even?
Yeah, thank you. It's a particular kind of transformation that I've been in. I think we can go through ones that are quite internal and purpose related, or ones that are thrust upon us because of a big external change happening in our lives, losing a job, losing a beloved. Ones that are, as I was saying, more internal, where there's just a feeling of change, right? Like a sense that things are moving in a different direction or need to, or a feeling of stagnation. And for me, I had a very physical signal of change. And so for me, this period of time has been marked by, I think, about a 10-year descent into chronic illness, where I missed a lot of signals in my body. I think I have a really good long history of overriding physical signals. And so, maybe just the arc of that before I talk about those signals that I might have missed, was a descent into a chronic illness over about 10 years, 5 of which were excruciating, 3 of which were the deepest suffering I have experienced in my life physically.
Yeah.
And out of that, there's my pup.
That's right. Hi, Nori.
out of that, and so then 3 years of that were just beyond unimaginable. And then a coming out of it, which is its own story, which we'll touch on. But I think there were a lot of physical signs along the way that I missed, and I want to set this in the context of, I think it's it's about 10% of the population that have chronic illness or immune or autoimmune illness, and that's actually probably underreported. And then out of that, about 80% are women.
Wow.
So I think, it's like I'm talking about my chronic illness story, but chances are every person listening to this podcast knows of a woman who is struggling in their body with some kind of either diagnosed ongoing illness or something that's undiagnosed that just feels off, right? And so I, for many years, was in that sort of, I just felt off, I lacked energy. I lacked, I mean, that was the biggest one to start with. I had all kinds of food sensitivities that increased over time. And then I just started having a lot of inflammation in my body, kind of multi-system inflammation. But Tuesday, I just kept pushing.
Yes, you did. Yeah.
I just kept going. And one of the things that I've learned through this process is actually, because work and purpose, we'll come back to this topic, I think, of purpose, the difference between purpose and pleasure. And I was a really purpose-driven person and had a real sense of what I wanted to do in the world and what I wanted to create. And I just kept using that to fuel me moving forward as I got worse and worse and worse. And now looking back, I understand that actually the adrenaline of the kind of work that I do and the love of the work that I do, adrenaline's a pretty powerful neurochemical that can actually override pretty much any physical symptom. And so we can become addicted to it as a way to feel better.
So this is amazing, Gabe, because I think, okay, wow. Because I am a person who gets really excited, right? About my work and what's going to happen. And not because I have grandiose schemes, but just because I love, right, the idea of like doing good work. What do we say all the time? Good work with good people, right? Like that's my jam. I'm really into it. And so I can feel as you say that, like, oh, the purpose, like how you can just justify anything through that purpose, right? You can justify all sorts of patterns of behavior of overwork and all of that. But you can actually like, it's not just like a physical justification. Your body is actually helping you override some of those signals. Because as you were speaking, those last 3 years, you and I were in some of the biggest work of our careers together. Right? We were flying around the world, doing really big work with really important organizations, doing meaningful work in the world, right? That was within that span of 3 years where you were in excruciating suffering. And those of us on your team, well, I mean, I think we had some idea what was happening, right? Your capacity to override and to not even somehow make it like a personal triumph, your capacity to override, or a personal failing, your capacity to override, but actually your body was helping you override.
Yeah. Which I didn't know at the time, right? And it was helping me override, and it was actually the place that I felt the most alive. And I felt the most well was when I was in my work. And then I would come home and I would crash, or, what I see, the term on a social media is bed rotting.
Oh, I've not heard that. I've not heard this. Okay.
People who kind of live the basics of the life that they have to and then collapse in bed, watch Netflix, like whatever the thing is, and so I would say that was, exactly the cycle for about 3 years. And then it got to the point where that didn't even work. And it was unavoidable. I had to step away from all of my work, all of the parts of my life that I loved. And I think that's when it was, the descent. As I was thinking about this today, one of the expressions is the dark night of the soul.
Yeah.
And for me, it was the dark night of the body. It was a really primal experience of being pushed so far into illness that there was no avoiding it. I couldn't, there were days and weeks that I didn't get out of bed. I was mostly housebound, I would say, for a year and a half.
Wow.
We stayed connected because we didn't live in the same city and I could join you on Zoom. But, it was this unavoidable, I was thrust into the intensity of symptoms and illness that subsumed me.
So Gabe, tell me a little bit more about what that was like. And why am I asking? I'm asking because I think that those of us who have experienced or are in the midst of a dark night of the soul or a dark night of the body, have an idea that it's a certain way or want it to be a certain way. And so I'm wondering, what is the wisdom of that place that you can share? Maybe now, maybe you didn't know it then, of course, but there's something for me around wanting to shine some light into that dark place so that we can actually be real about what it's like.
Okay, before I go there, I want to give a little caveat, which is, as much as this illness has been a journey of profound transformation for me, I just want to recognize all of the people who are living with chronic illness and chronic conditions where you can't come out the other side physically.
Yeah. Great. Thank you, Gabe.
And
thank you.
And I just to add to that there are so many reasons why so many women struggle in feeling well in their bodies for really good external reasons. Whether it's genetics, modern stresses, carrying family loads, just having an additional X chromosome that activates our immune systems. I mean, there's so much there. And so I just want to say, while I have had a transformative experience through this illness, there are many people who live with ongoing disability. And so wellness and complete recovery is not available for everybody. And to just to want to really value that is its own journey of experience. So I want to say that to start. And then being in this dark night of the body, I mean, I'd been curious about it. I've always been a person who's been interested in personal transformation and social transformation. I mean, that's one of the ways that you and I met in our work around that. So I think I've always been interested in it and conceptually, curious about it, and had certainly gone through hard times in my life. But this was one where everything was stripped away. And not externally, I mean, I still had my relationship. I still had my family. I still, but the experience of having health taken away so fully. And also cognitive ability. So I also couldn't think in the ways that I love to think about things. I became quite a visceral, stripping away of everything. And one way that's helpful for me to describe it is this story of a moment where a friend texted me and just said, I love you, I miss you. And my I started to text back, I miss you too. But actually what came up as I was typing that was, I miss me too.
Wow. Right. Oh, wow.
And then when I shared this with the friend later, they said, oh, well, I just want you to know, it's not that I miss I want you to know I don't miss you. I don't miss the old you. Like, I'm ready for the new you. I'm ready for whoever you are on this side of it. And I went, oh, actually, that's not even what I meant. What I meant was I miss having the human capacity to feel well
Oh,
enough to connect with the world.
oh my goodness. Yeah.
And I think that that's quite a different kind of dark night than a spiritual dark night.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It has a different dimension, and again, it's not guaranteed that we'll come out the other side of a physical illness or a disability. So there's a little bit into that window of what that felt like.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Really indescribable and
Hmm.
unimaginable for those of us who have not experienced it, right? Like I can hear the words, but it's
Yeah,
such a, as you said, visceral experience, right?
yeah,
As to be kind of inaccessible for those of us who haven't experienced it. So I'm curious, Gabe, and I don't want to move us along too fast, but I'm curious, like, I don't even know if I want to, you can see if you're watching on the video, you can see my hands are like, kind of like, okay, so you go into this dark night of the body and you stay there, right?
hmm,
I think for many of us in kind of transformation, we're like, okay, you do the descent and you use the word descent, right? When we think about
hmm,
descent journeys, it's like, okay, we descend, we hit the bottom and then we start going up. But often like in a descent journey, there's like a hanging out in the low
yeah,
place for far longer than we ever want or ever could have imagined. Um, and then the ascent is often slow, certainly never how we want it to be. We talked about signals earlier. It's following small signals. It's not major leaps, but I'm curious if you could begin to describe or share your understanding of your own kind of ascent
yeah,
back from that.
yeah. Thank you. So it's been about 3 years since I hit the hardest place in that story. And I would say I was still in that dark night of the body. So at that moment, that was when I made all of the decisions to completely and utterly change my life in every
Mm-hmm.
way. Like when there was nowhere else to turn was the moment. There was nothing else I could do out of productivity, out of purpose, out of
Mm.
moving things around, out of, you know, booking the next appointment with the next specialist or the next doctor. There was a moment that I was confronted with, there is nowhere else to go but to change. Uh, I'm so grateful it got that bad. I'm so
Wow.
grateful it got that
Wow.
bad
Mm.
because I often wonder how long I could have just kept going in the version of keeping everything and piecing it together. Like, I think that stop, that physical, I was unable to keep going now. I'm so grateful that it happened and that it happened when it did. I mean, sometimes I feel grief that it didn't happen earlier,
Mm-hmm.
but mostly I think I've worked through that. And I mean, grief is a big part of this that maybe we'll get to. But so it's been about 3 years since that moment. And I would say a good year and a half of it for me was uh, a complete unknown.
Mm.
I brought in a lot of daily practices, healthcare practices, stress release practices. One of the things that you and I have talked about is my real dedication to nervous system regulation,
Mm-hmm.
which I'm a huge advocate of. I was doing a lot of physical treatment at that time, but there was a complete surrendering
Mm.
to turning toward not what I wanted to do, but what I thought my body needed
Mm.
in a
Mm.
in a wiser, bigger way, and not a should. It didn't feel like a should. It just actually felt like a listening in a different way for the first time, which was not about my personal preferences,
Right.
right?
Or Gabe doing it right so that,
Yes.
right?
And I had to completely let go of any version of recovery in that
Mm-hmm.
time, which was agonizing because of course that is what I wanted. deeply wanted it. So I would say about a year and a half of this sense of, is this going to make a difference? Is this not? Is this going to make a difference? Is this not? And I started to get these moments, these glimmers, and they were so brief at first. But it was a moment of some peace or some calm or a sense, just even an inch of safety in my body.
Wow.
And those didn't come consistently or predictably in any way. They would arrive in a moment, and sometimes they would be a flash, and I'd go, did it happen? Did I feel that? And then over time, more of them started to pop up. Sometimes I would regress back into some of the deepest and hardest parts and think, oh no, I'm getting worse, not better. But then another glimmer would come, another moment in my body, another occasion of security and safety. And then those started to build, and then they started to lengthen, and it took a long time.
Okay. I want to know,
Yes.
like, what happened for you as they started to lengthen, how you might have. So we'll go back to that. But first, I want to ask you, because you said something really interesting in a meeting you and I were in this week. You said that often happens, that you start to get better and then you feel worse. And that is actually predictable, that it is not something. I think we were talking specifically around regulation and nervous system regulation, that once you kind of start on that path, there can be times of what we might think of as backslide or increased symptoms that have you wondering if you're on the right path, but it actually is a sign that you're on the right path. And I think that that's important. So if you can talk about that a little bit, because I see that in, you're talking about a dark night of the body, but I see that in spiritual transformation as well.
Yeah. And I think maybe the example in the body is helpful because we see it in these other ways too, in a spiritual transformation. So, one of the things in nervous system regulation work is around, or one of the aspects is based on polyvagal theory, and the vagus nerve is what runs kind of between. It's really the highway of our autonomic nervous system, which governs our fight or flight, or our rest and digest and connect and heal. And in the polyvagal theory or understanding of this, if we're moving from, say, a sympathetic dominant sort of stress response in the body. So say we're someone who's lived with a lot of chronic stress, that can be a sense of activation. We might be running on our adrenal, the adrenaline is something that's really fueling us. Cortisol, stress hormones, all of these things can be what moves us forward in life, and we're working at a particular pace. And then there's actually a layer below that, which is often called the dorsal vagal shutdown, which is when people just go into freeze. They might be in functional freeze. They might be able to get things done, but they're freezing. And so I think that's the whole bed rotting syndrome. But one of the things that happens in nervous system regulation, which is as we do practices to help bring our body out of those responses into that rest, digest, connect, and heal, it can actually take, depending on the person, months, days, weeks, months for the nervous system to unravel enough, to unwind enough, to move through a sympathetic response into the parasympathetic, that rest state. And so we can start the process and feel a little bit better, but then as we go deeper into the practices, what can happen, as you said, is in a physical sense, if you have chronic illness, your symptoms can get a lot worse. And this really happened to me. But one of the signs that you're on the right path is if you get those glimmers. Like if I get a glimmer of actual safety in my body, or a moment of, when I think about anxiety, how anxiety can play into the nervous system in big ways, a moment of feeling less anxious or feeling anxiety drop away, those are the signs that we're headed in the right direction.
Mm-hmm.
And part of it is then not to push through it, but to pace the transformation, pace the intensity, so that the
Mm-hmm.
body and the spirit and the mind and the heart can all adjust and adapt and integrate into that next level. So it's not about pushing through in any way, but it is about a kind of a persistence of continuing, even just a sprinkle
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
of what we're doing, and allowing the system to adjust to that new state.
Instead of feeling like, oh, this means it's not working, I'm failing, nothing. You know what I mean? There's something there around the linearity that we want in recovery.
Yes.
And so we'll talk about recovery with bodies, but even the linearity we want in our own kind of personal transformation, we just
Yes.
want it. It's like it's like the capitalism model, right? Of growth. Just go better, just be better. I'll just feel better, right?
Yeah.
Instead of like fits and starts and back and forth. And that's like a really natural rhythm. And it's our body adjusting. It could be our spirit adjusting, our psyche adjusting to this new way of being, this new state, this new experience, right? And so what happened is just to paraphrase, saw the glimmers kind of lengthened, and then it became kind of like more glimmery than not. And that's my words. And how would you, because I described you as glowing at the beginning. And again, the only reason I say that is because I've known you for a really long time.
Yes.
And in the last 6 months, right, it has just been like, I see Gabe and it's like, well, that one's lit up from inside. And so what is happening over there? And so I'm curious, how you might describe where you are now, what you understand now, not that you've achieved, not like you've arrived, but just kind of like, what is happening for you now and what are you understanding?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it has been the last 6 months in particular where I am trusting myself and my body that it can handle the world, and it can handle, that I can handle anything that comes my way, no matter how hard it is. And that, and so I feel really alive, which I didn't for many, many years. But I feel a real life force flowing through me. And part of that is a sense of innate trust. Now, we'll talk about an internal compass, but not only, I've built my internal compass. I don't know if maybe a version of it pre-existed, maybe I shined it off, but there's something too that feels like I have found it. I'm caring for it. I'm checking in with it. And that has led me to, alongside just really working at a physiological level around nervous system regulation practices, which are still a core part of my daily life. And that, I think that the big change that's happened in the past 6 months is because I had been doing so much strong work around my body, I can now handle going into the harder and darker places in my own psyche and history and experience that are some of the things that led me, I think, to pushing through more. So the inability to say no as a woman, right? Needing to care for other people, needing to say yes, needing to meet others' needs. And I'd be just like, I'm a millennial. We've been talking about boundary setting for ages. Ages. I don't know if we knew how to do it. And now I know how to do it. Because it is choiceless for me now living in this body. Like, this is how, for me to be able to show up and contribute and have vitality. Yeah, so there's this degree of I have an internal compass. I know how to relate to it. And I'm doing deeper internal work about my history and my past, a different kind of going into the dark that I
Okay,
have
Gabe.
capacity for now that I didn't before.
I just have to ask you about this because I mean, of course. And like this back and forth between the body and what it's capable of, the soul and what it needs, and the psyche, like the psychological piece, right? Like of the patterns. And like, of course, all of these things are interwoven, and any of us might enter in different ways, right? It could be a mental illness that puts us into
Yes.
a dark night. It could be a soul crisis. It could be a body crisis. Of course, these things are intertwined. So it makes sense that as you work with the body, these other things become available. And I have to ask you, because you said, I'm a millennial. We've talked about boundaries forever. And so I want to ask, and I'm trying to think about how to ask this question to get, I feel like sometimes right now the boundaries conversation is a lot about protecting us because we're so fragile, right? Like there's like, I got to protect my me time. I'm just not feeling up to it today. Like there's something that has a air of fragility around it.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And that's not the way I experience you setting your boundaries, because of course we work together and sometimes you have to set boundaries with me on projects, right? Around what is going to happen or not happen. But I don't feel like it's a projecting when it actually legit could be, right? Like your body has been under siege, right? There is some fragility in this system, or maybe there is, or maybe that's not how you see it. But that's not how I experience you setting your boundaries. It doesn't feel protecting of a fragility. It feels just from the outside. So I want to hear your experience from the inside. It feels like an assertion towards your health, which doesn't actually feel defensive or protective of fragility. It feels grounded. It feels clear. And it feels like not like I'm being assaulted, but more like I can take care of myself.
That distinction is so helpful for me to hear because that feels true. And
Great.
that feels very true. And, I'm thinking about it with you now in this moment. What feels different about that? And I certainly know the other version of boundary setting, which is too much has been put on me. I am overwhelmed. You are making a request of me that I cannot handle.
Yeah.
I know that version.
Of course.
Because I was in that version too, even while I was meeting all of the needs of all of the things.
Yes.
This version does feel different because there is a sense I don't feel like I'm protecting a self that is falling apart and fraying at the edges and just trying to stave off the pressure. I feel like I have this treasure. And I don't know where the metaphor is going to go, but like it does feel more, it's like it has a generosity to it, and it has in order for me to expand, in order for me to be expansive and to really show up in my life and in my relationships in deep and meaningful and open-hearted ways, fully, to be alive, to be here, to be present in the now, it just requires a different kind of edge tending. And yeah, so maybe it isn't boundaries in in the way that the word is used. It's like I'm actually saying yes to a lot more things, but I think it's an edge tending. And I'm going to unpack that more now, I think, after this conversation and why it feels different. But you've really spoken to how it feels different. And I'm glad to hear that that's how it appears, how it shows up in the world, because it's quite a different way of being.
Yeah. Yeah. And it feels like it's just part of you, which is really beautiful. Wonderful. Let me ask, because I could just talk to you forever about this, but I'm wondering if
why we're friends.
Exactly. Yes. We will continue this conversation. And perhaps some of that will get on the podcast again. But I'm thinking about this particular, we've talked about your dark night of the body. And is there anything else you are learning or would want to share that feels like it helps what we've said today just kind of be whole and not miss anything significant?
I think a real principle from my recovery that I think is good for any dark night of the soul or the body or the spirit or the psyche is low and slow.
Whoa.
Like,
yeah.
Titrate. This idea of titration, which is the strength of the medicine.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the things that, and this was such a big part that I had to let go of in this process, was because of my purpose, my momentum, my ability to get things done, to generate forward movement. I mean, so many things that, we talk about in our work, in our other work, in ways we're connected. But that kind of sense of getting her done does not work in this kind of process.
Whoa.
And so I think part of that surrendering to this, the calibration of what is too much and what is too little at a micro level in a day, in a moment, in a morning. So it's not like what, say someone is taking on a new practice in their life. I'll use something quite simple, like maybe morning pages, 2 morning pages every day. That's the thing to do. It's like, no, maybe it's a sentence. Maybe another day it's 5 pages. Maybe it's a week where you go for a walk outside instead. But that there's something about attuning to what is needed in the moment and at the right dose. Because I think part of the negative kinds of backslides where we feel a sense of stagnation or a sense that we're not moving forward, even towards those glimmers, I think, for me at least, was when I was too heavy-handed about that directionality. And it was actually in the release of that and the calibration in micro moments where things actually began to shift. When my body started to trust me. Oh yeah, you're going to listen. Hi. You're going to really listen to what I need. You're trustworthy. And I think all of these parts of ourself, I love internal family systems as an approach, because it recognizes that we have these different aspects of who we are that have different needs and wants and have been formed in different ways. And so to be able to bring those parts into conversation and dialogue with each other and to negotiate needs inside this kind of constellation of self rather than as one single entity, with with complete coherence, has been a huge part of this.
Right. Oh, there's so many threads to pull. I want to pull 2 before we kind of do a little closing. One is so much of what you're talking about, actually, you said it as changes of behavior. But it's also really speaking to a shift in foundational values and foundational feelings of worth, right? When you talk about get her done, right? That is like a value. To complete things, to be dependable, to be a person who pushes through, and that's all about self-concept and worth, right?
Yes.
I am good because right? Rather than just foundational, I am good. And I wondered if you could talk about that. And then we did say we'd talk about grief before we close. So I wanted to, those are the 2 things.
values, I love that you brought up values. That has been a big part of, so the methodology that I've been using as part of my recovery, which but for listeners, it's called Primal Trust. It's specifically for people who have chronic illness. But in that work, once you've settled the body and the nervous system, you move into the exploration of the self. And one of the first things that we do is orient towards adjectives that describe us when we are our healthiest, our happiest, our most balanced, or integrated. And then we really do an investigation of what our personal values are, and then really distill them down into something so through that process, really coming to about 5 to 6 values that I actually use as an orientation every day. So part of my day starts with a reminder. Part of my contemplation in the mornings is a reminder of the values that guide my life, that I want to guide my life, that I'm stepping towards. And then finding ways to visualize my day in a way that is expressing those, stepping towards them, bringing them in, really that sense of activating them. And that's been a huge practice that has stayed with me as a really important fundamental to how, again, your words, how do I relate to my internal compass every day? And it's just having, knowing them, saying them, writing them out, and I mean, there's tremendous power in the work around the research around neuroplasticity and how we can change habits and behaviors through repetition. And sometimes that repetition is just writing, saying, articulating, imagining, and doing it over and over again. So that's, I will tell you, I would have been someone who scoffed at the importance of values, because I felt like it was too, I would have maybe felt like it was too confining or too, I don't even know. I don't know why I would have judged it, but I would have.
Okay.
I would have thought there's more deep spiritual work to do than articulating your values. And now I'm like, no, really getting clear on what those are and when I am out of alignment with them is just helpful data.
Great. Wonderful. Anything you want to say about grief? And we don't have to. We just said we'd mention it, but we do not have to in any way.
I will just say there's the grief that overtakes us and washes us through. And then I think that can be incremental grief that happens in life around regret. And through this journey, there has been a lot of moments of feeling regret about my younger self and the decisions that she made. And I think through a lot of this recovery, I actually just noticed this particular version of grief. It kind of comes and invites me out on occasion to have a conversation, to go for a walk, to have a dance. And I'm learning to just meet her in those moments. And every time that I do, it's softer. She's a part that I'm really seeing and relating to and tending to after so many years of it just being too painful to go there. So yeah, there's something about another layer of trust. I trust she'll come to me when I have the bandwidth and the capacity to turn toward that a little more. And it's felt really sweet and tender and very loving.
Okay, Gabe. Well, I'm just going to ask you right now. I think we need to have you back on to talk about grief. I think that would be a wonderful, another whole podcast. You and me, maybe someone else I can think of. Because I've been experiencing some real grief this last 6 months as well. And so it feels like, all right, that's just like a little teaser. Let's go back to that. And I want to finish with a practice. But before I give that, I want to ask, do you have a question or anything you want to ask me at this moment?
I do. I mean,
Okay.
thank you for the opportunity to talk about myself. You know, I'm also endlessly curious about you and your experiences. And I just want to ask you about, and I love this idea and this concept and this practice of returning and finding our internal compass. And one of the things that I've just seen and noticed in you is that you have this capacity to stay firm when your sense of what you're moving towards doesn't make logical sense.
Mm.
Like there's something about like the desire to make sense of where we're going and where we're headed can be so seductive, right? And there's just something about the way that you're like able to articulate that or let it go or work through it and so I'm just really curious, what does that look like for you?
Oh, thanks, Gabe. Well, I like to say I'm a sense-making machine, right? Like that is like
You
my
are.
happy space, like seeing
Yes.
patterns, making meaning. Like I love that. That settles me like nothing else in the world is to make sense of things. That being said, um, I think that frankly, this comes from a childhood with a lot of abuse in it. That I actually couldn't look to what the outside world said makes sense was often not what made sense internally to me. And the explanations of why and what and how out there, it was like, well, I don't think I believe that, or that doesn't sit right with me. And so I did a lot in my childhood of just like, okay, this is what makes sense. Like, this is what's real to me, even if it's not real out there. And so I think I got fairly comfortable with understanding that my reality or what made sense to me wasn't going to make sense out there. And so, like, from an early age, I just was like, well, I'm kind of out of sync. You know what I mean? I'm just kind of out of sync. And so I think I spent then that was true internally. And then I spent a lot of years trying to get in sync with out there. Right. And I got some good benefits from that. Right. Like built a life that I wouldn't have had. Um, you know, um, found security in a way that wasn't possible in my childhood by kind of like looking out there to what makes sense. And so it's been probably really, late 30s into my 40s where I was like, wait a second, I've never actually really bought that stuff. How do I begin to live in a way that only makes sense to me? Because, yeah. So I don't know if that's a complete answer, but I really actually think it's like from the littlest age where I was like, I don't know what those bozos are doing, but that's not for me.
Right.
And so like I just kind of, figured it out.
Yeah. I
Thanks.
love how you use this expression, feeling out of sync and being in, and I feel like that's another place to explore in the future, because sometimes when we are connected to our own internal compass, as you've just described, it actually means that we feel out of sync with a lot of what's happening around us. And I would say that has been it's not a challenge, but it's a curiosity for me in this phase. And you too, this has been so much of our conversation over the past few years, and for me in particular in the last 6 months or so, I just feel really out of sync with what's happening around me. It's okay. I can hold that capacity and that tension. That is a better trade-off than being in sync and in sync with the world and out of sync with myself.
Yes. I think that's okay. So so that'll be our podcast 3. How about like being in sync with yourself versus outer? Because I think that's really important, because I think actually for me in early life, that caused a lot of suffering to feel out of sync. And now I'm just like more okay with it. Like, oh, okay. Apparently I'm not in sync, and that's cool. Okay. So grief, we're going to do one on grief. We're going to do one around syncing with yourself. And I want to leave listeners with a practice. And it is not, like a formal practice, but I was really struck, Gabe, when you pulled pleasure out from purpose. And if I know who's listening, right, people who have followed me, like we're big on like landing on purpose and moving from there, right? Finding your compass and moving from there, finding purpose or meaning in your work. And so I think maybe it's not even a practice, it's a challenge between now and the next podcast for listeners to begin to seek pleasure that is actually outside of their purpose, right? To just a thing or two that is not because of where it's going to take you, or not because it's good for the world, or not anything except it is like seeking pleasure, which I think could be pretty radical for folks. So that's the invitation. Find some pleasure outside of your purpose in the next couple weeks, and listen to what comes up for you when you do, because I imagine lots will come up for people. Thank you so much, Gabe. It's been so good to have you on today.
Thank you, Tuesday. I loved it.
Oh, and we'll have you on for episode 2 and 3. Thank you, everyone. You can be in touch, of course, through podcast@tuesdayrivera.com. If you have questions or want to give feedback or are thinking about anything, certainly, I think this is the point where they always say, rate, review, and respond on iTunes and all of those things. You know what? That would be amazing if folks would do that. But really, I just love it. If you loved this episode, share it with somebody. That'd be the way to get the word out. So thank you, everyone, and we'll see you next time.